All right, folks, today we're going to sit down and talk about Justice Anthony Kennedy and what his stepping down means to the country. But before I do that, I do want to remind everybody that June was just a handful of days ago, and in June, the Inspector General's report was released, there was a border crisis, and the North Korea summit took place in which Donald Trump met with Kim Jong-un. And so many other major stories happened in June. And right now, I can't speak for anybody else, but I know for me, it feels like all of those stories happened months and even years ago. But this Anthony Kennedy thing has pretty much dominated the news cycle for the last almost week. And I've put a lot of thought into it. I know when it first came out, I was like most of the people on the conservative base, where I thought to myself, this is going to be very exciting, and we're going to get another absolute constitutionalist on the Supreme Court. After all, that was what we were promised when Donald Trump was campaigning for president. But I've spent a lot of the last few weeks sitting down and listening to a lot of points of view. I even went as far as to go and listen to Pod Save America on the topic. I listened to that earlier today. And after gathering a lot of the facts into my head and looking at the way that people were reacting to the situation and really thinking about strategy going into a midterm election, I've come to what I feel would be the best conclusion and the best solution for the problem of what to do about our upcoming justice. The first thing that you have to think about when you think about strategy on justices going forward is first the immediate reaction of the people that are on the left on Twitter and other social media to the news that Anthony Kennedy decided that he was going to retire. Apparently, according to Twitter, Anthony Kennedy is the greatest traitor of our time because he decided that he needed to step down while Trump was president, giving Donald Trump the ability to nominate a new justice. What's interesting about the reactions is it gives light to the way that the people on the left and the people that support them have been using the Supreme Court for just about my entire life and probably long before, judging by the way people feel about Roe versus Wade. Mainstream conservative commentator Sean Hannity liked to talk about the fact that the Supreme Court was legislating from the bench during the Obama years, and even before that. And he also liked to talk about the fact that if Hillary Clinton had become president, she would have appointed activists to the court in order to continue to legislate from the bench. I want to take a second and explain what that means. Ben Shapiro may have summed it up perfectly. What Hannity means from legislate by the bench is the same thing as most commentators mean when they say legislate by executive fiat. There are a number of items in the leftist agenda right now, and a number of them that have already come to pass, that could not pass Congress. They couldn't get the votes in the districts. They couldn't get the Congress people to vote on them in enough of a majority to push them through. And of course, in cases, they couldn't get the president to sign them. In the cases where it was something where Obama wanted it enshrined in law, but he couldn't get the votes out of Congress to get his proposal passed, he would just take out his pen and do an executive order. But there were other cases going through, and one of the most famous ones is Roe versus Wade, which should have been a states' right issue above anything else. That's what's mentioned in the 10th Amendment. But our Supreme Court legislated that from the bench. When they couldn't get a federal abortion right passed through Congress, the justices on the Supreme Court went ahead and legislated that there was nothing in the Constitution that said that you couldn't get an abortion, therefore it was a right. It's interesting to look at that from both sides because I did grow up on a left-leaning point of view, and when you're younger, obviously, and you're in school, you're learning it from your teachers who think that the court did the right thing on Roe versus Wade. I heard a lot of that from a lot of my teachers. And technically they are right. There is nothing in the Constitution that says that abortion should be illegal. And it all comes down to the definition of when human life starts. That's a topic for another day. But unfortunately, that's not something I feel that should be settled on a federal level. There are a lot of cases that have gone through the Supreme Court. Gay marriage is another big one, where I don't think that should have been a federal level distinction. States issue marriage licenses. That should be a state-to-state regulation as to how they want marriage treated with the licenses that they issue. It's interesting because when you listen to a left-leaning show like anything on CNN or Pod Save America, that's the first thing that they cite. Abortion is about to be illegal. CNN put out an article saying that within 18 months, abortion was going to be illegal in like 20 states, which it's the state's prerogative to decide whether or not they have to do. Let the representatives talk to their constituency and see how they feel about it. But we really do need to sit down and stick with the topic of Kennedy and his replacement going forward. Now, Anthony Kennedy was appointed by a man that most people consider to be the super conservative, Ronald Reagan. But as Michael Knowles likes to say, Anthony Kennedy was kind of a squishy Republican. He kind of swung both ways on it. He was considered to be the major swing vote on the court. He went with the left-leaning justices on some issues and the right-leaning justices on other, especially in a slew of cases that came under review just this past week that really had very little media coverage, I might add. I mentioned Hannity before because he was one of the first people to come out and say that the first thing that we need to do is get another Neil Gorsuch or Scalia-typed originalist onto the court. And I thought about that, and I actually thought that that should have been the first way that we should have gone as well. Shapiro kind of echoed this same sentiment. And both of them do understand what the meaning of the court was, and that's part of the reason that they hold that position. I want to talk about that a little bit right now, what that court actually is versus what it's been used for. The first thing I want to say is that to anybody who's saying that the shift upcoming in the Supreme Court is going to affect generations has no idea what the court is there for. The way the Constitution framed the Supreme Court, most people in this country are never going to have to deal with it. The Supreme Court is an appellate court. It isn't actually a legislative wing of the government. And what that means is that a decision in a lower court or a circuit court that comes out to be unjust for the defendant can be appealed to a higher court. From a local court, you would want to take it to your state's Supreme Court, and from there you would want to go to a circuit court before going to the Supreme Court of the United States. And in that appeals process, the higher courts would check the constitutionality on either the state or the circuit or the federal level of the decision that was made by the lower court. Now, yes, I understand that appeals that are made in higher courts set precedents that lawyers will then use to cite during criminal or property trials going forward. But in reality, most of the people in this country are never going to be involved in that system. For the most part, most people in this country, if they ever do get into an incident where they have to deal with the legal system, it's going to be either a small claim or a misdemeanor. The decision is going to be pretty well cemented by the local judge, and it's really not going to be worth the cost and money to appeal it to a higher court. Most of these cases are open and shut, cut and dry. So with that being said, I'm really going to come out and say that a lot of this fuss that's on Twitter and on Facebook and in the news is really kind of worthless. And it's just too much effort for something that's not going to affect the majority of people who are posting about it. But since this has become a part of our mainstream life, and it seems to be something that's deeply keeping people from sleeping at night, especially on the left, let's take some time and talk about what we do need to do going forward on it. Now, as I mentioned before, a lot of the far-right punditry out there likes to come out and say that we should just go ahead and have another strict constitutionalist like Gorsuch or Scalia. And in a perfect world, I think that would be great because that would help uphold the role that the court was originally intended to take by the Constitution itself. It would start taking some of the activism out of it and start taking it out of everybody else's everyday life, which I believe is a good thing. Unfortunately, that is not the best decision for the American people right now, as much as I would like to see it go into effect. Now, before I go into what's going to be best, I also do want to take some time and cite what people on social media are saying so you understand what is coming out of this and where the opposition is coming from. The majority of the people that are posting angrily on Twitter believe that this next pick should be First off, it should be Hillary's pick because they believe that in a just world, Hillary or even Bernie would be the president right now. But most of them are also saying that this should be another left-wing activist, basically a Ruth Bader Ginsburg 2.0, which, as I've laid out before, I think is probably one of the worst ideas in the world, and it really distorts the role of the court in American society. And there are two other big oppositional statements that are coming to this. First off, most of the people on the ground want to come out and say that nobody should be able to appoint a Supreme Court justice if he or she is under a federal investigation. Since the IG report was buried by the news, a lot of them are forgetting the fact that Hillary Clinton ran almost her entire campaign under a federal investigation. I'm actually a little encouraged by this because our mainstream media, which has obvious issues with the president, as well as alt media on the left, which for obvious reason also has issues with our president, are avoiding this topic. Both of them have done the research and they know that there really isn't anything that's in the Constitution that prevents any of this. And unfortunately, the last president to be impeached prior to what I fear may be upcoming for this president, depending on the results of the midterm, was a Democrat, and that could screw them in elections going forward and presidencies going forward. So good job on the media and the alt media for keeping this dangerous precedent quelled. I will give you all props for that. And then there's also the opposition that went around Neil Gorsuch's seat on the court, where it was the biggest political hijacking in history. Barack Obama, as a lame duck president, wanted to appoint a Supreme Court nominee when Justice Scalia died. And he did. He put Merrick Garland forward. But there were two big obstacles to this. One of the issues with this was a precedent that was set during the previous administration with Joe Biden and a George W. Bush pick for the Supreme Court, in which they didn't want George W. Bush to have the pick while he was on his way to being out of office. And the other one was the fact that Obama really couldn't get anybody approved because he couldn't get anybody through the Senate. The Senate already had the votes at the time to block anybody that Obama wanted to put through. None of this is really a hijacking either. This is just checks and balances in the Constitution that are working the way that they should in order to keep one branch from becoming overpowered and canceling out the other two completely. It's the way that we kept from having a monarchy for 242 years, even though there have been numerous people that have come through the presidency and numerous Congress people as well who have thought that one branch should be superior to all of the others. It's the system of checks and balances that most of us over the age of 30 learned when we were in civics class. Now, as far as what we do about the open seat, first off, most people think that because this is a midterm election year, we should be waiting until after the midterm election. And I don't believe that's true. While I definitely believe that a Supreme Court justice hanging in the balance would definitely be an energizing thing and would drive more people out to the polls to participate in our democratic process, which is definitely a good thing, it makes the entire election a single issue election, and that is not something that I agree with. I'm going to come right out and say it. Even with Republicans, who I would definitely tend to vote for, I want them to sell me their pitches. I want them to try and buy my vote, in a manner of speaking. From both sides, I want to hear their policy prescriptions. I want to hear what it is that they want to do. I do not want this midterm to come down to a complete single issue item. And unfortunately, right now, it's already devolving into that. From the looks of the way things are going, our midterm is going to come down to whether we impeach Trump or whether we keep Trump. And that's a single issue vote that I don't want to see happen. Imagine the way that both sides would be campaigning going into the midterms if the only thing that was held in the balance would be whether or not Trump got to pick a Supreme Court justice or not. And unfortunately, the socialist wing that's in control of the Democrat Party right now doesn't really have anything else on their platform. I've seen a couple of other things come up with healthcare in the very recent weeks, but for the most part, there really isn't any sort of platform out there other than we're going to go out and impeach Trump. And we're the party of not Trump. I want to hear about your tax cuts. I want to hear about your healthcare proposals. I want to hear whether or not you're going to try and pull government power away from the federal government and back down into the state governments and the localities where it belongs. These are the issues that I want to talk about when we're talking about who's going to be elected and the way that the Congress is going to shift in the upcoming midterm, not whether or not our president gets to pick a Supreme Court justice. So, I've been alluding to what it is that we should do for this entire video, and then I've been avoiding the topic. And honestly, Hexenhammer 666 said it the best. Strategically, the best thing that we could do with this open court seat would be to appoint a Kennedy 2.0 to this seat and continue to put more conservative justices and judges on lower courts instead. 4 months out of the midterm, the best thing that we could possibly do would be to punt on this issue. At this point, the court has already shifted into a conservative and constitutionalist favor, so Donald Trump can afford to put somebody who is kind of a swing vote back into the position that would be a swing vote. It doesn't really upset the balance, and we go back to talking about the issues that we already had before Kennedy decided to resign going into this midterm. It carries us through the midterm. Strategically, I don't know what's going to happen with Ruth Bader Ginsburg at this point either. I do fear that she is either going to die or retire going into the 2020 election, and we're going to be having this same discussion again. And it's going to be a much harder discussion when Ginsburg decides to step off of the court, whether voluntarily or by death. And we have to talk about upsetting the balance of the court because we're going to replace essentially a leftist activist with somebody who we would want to be a constitutionalist or at least a swing vote as well. In fact, I think one of the worst things that could happen to the court would be for Ginsburg to pass along or retire before the 2020 election, unfortunately. Even though many other commentators have said that that would probably be one of the best things, I think that would probably be one of the most polarizing things in this country right now. Simply put, if you put a strict constitutionalist or a conservative into the seat that Kennedy is vacating right now, you are going to drive more Democrat turnout to the polls, and especially socialist turnout to the polls on a midterm election where people normally wouldn't even go out to vote. A midterm election where people sometimes forget that the election is even coming up. And that's my policy prescription. I know it's probably not going to reach the ears of anybody in the federal government because I'm just a small YouTuber from Wisconsin, as I like to mention here and there. But I think that is going to be what is the best for our country going forward. Take a punt on this particular justice and put another person with almost the exact same political ideals in his place and let the swing vote carry on. Our country will thank us for it later, and going any further to the right than that is a one-way ticket to the articles of impeachment, as the House and Senate are both turned back over to angry activist leftists that got voted in. And especially, like I mentioned before, we do need to do this before the midterm election. We cannot let this midterm election turn into a single-issue election when there are so many good things that could be proposed on both sides of the aisle. What do you think about the fact that Justice Kennedy is deciding to retire going into a midterm election? And who do you think Donald Trump should put into his place and why? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comment section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at EdsBlog Twitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care, everyone.